Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's show is actually the first installment of the Witchkin series from the wonderful mind of Wayne Harbison. You guys actually started this series from the third chapter, or third part should I say, down to my own mistake. Didn't realise that actually the story was connected with the first two stories that Wayne had sent me. My own mistake, and apologies so much to Wayne. I'm so cheesed off because the series is just so engaging and just one of the best series I've ever featured on the channel. Very proud and very honoured to feature it on the channel exclusively. So I do apologise for messing up the pattern or route of the story, but I'm only human, guys, and I'm trying my best here. Anyway, as ever, please do let us know down below in the comments what you thought. Please do like and share, help build the channel and our community further. And of course, don't forget to hashtag TeamFEAR and be safe, not sorry. Without further ado, let's get into tonight's story, entitled Shadows on Mobile Bay. Let's get straight into that. I looked at the burned out ruins of my family's home, the still open mausoleum that held the crypts of my parents, my sisters, and my wife who died of scarlet fever before I went to fight in the war. I looked back at the carriage that held the broken body and mind of my younger brother. The Union had done what it had set out to do. Like the great snake that directed its actions from the hidden shadows of state, it had crushed the South. The city of Mobile may have been spared the destruction of the Union forces, but had not been spared their incompetence when they accidentally blew apart nearly a third of that city by not properly securing their ammunition depot. And the surrounding plantations had not been spared the torch nor the raiders that had come afterward. What the Union had not burned to the ground, the bombers that followed had, and they'd taken other liberties upon my family, my mother and my sisters, and forced my father to watch helplessly before torturing my brother and then leaving him and father to die. Only my younger brother had survived the beatings and torture, and that survival had been tenuous at best. I looked down from the back of my hunter at the hungry dark faces of the slaves that had once been a part of our plantation, Chateau-de-la-Mer. I had no idea whether they had aided the Union or the looters that came afterward, and to be honest, I did not care. Our property had been shattered, our family killed, and worse, they had survived. I simply knew that the Union government had freed them with an illegal proclamation from a train in Gettysburg. They no longer belonged to Chateau-de-la-Mer. They no longer belonged to me. "What should we do, Mr. McNaughton?" one of the bigger men asked. "Where should we go?" For long moments I stared at the wreckage of what had once been a great house of the southern aristocracy, now brought low. I had signed my oath of loyalty to Appomattox and the left Virginia, and with only my horse and my meagre handful of captured rations that General Grant had obliged us. Granted, I fared far better than most of my brothers in arms, but that was only because of the witcheries my heritage gave me. The same witcheries that had let me survive the war unscathed. Witcheries that were for the most part unknown to the world, and that the necessity of battle had begun to hone more than the discipline of West Point. The months-long ride back home had been humiliating, and I had paid scant attention to the countryside as I travelled. Only the thoughts of seeing my family again gave me a bittersweet solace. Now this, all gone, burnt to the ground and destroyed. The only thing in all of Chateau-de-la-Mer still standing were the slave quarters. It had taken me months to find Teddy, to establish myself again with my solicitors, and to retrieve enough of my father's wealth so as to render the threat of seizure of Chateau-de-la-Mer a moot point. That also required a great deal of my use of witcheries, and over a year of hard work and not a little subterfuge. I may have vowed not to take up arms against the government, but that did not mean that I nor my family were required to become the victims of it either. its carpetbagger interlopers, nor the freedmen the northern interlopers sought to set over us. I looked over at the man asking questions. Ignorant eyes pleaded with me to feed him, to care for him, because neither he nor any of the others were fit to care for themselves. You are no longer my property. Silas, the Union government has seen fit to set you free. As you are no longer my property, you are no longer my responsibility. I looked over at the long rows of cabins built to house and feed the slaves. Beyond them were the burned out cotton fields now lying neglected and uncultivated. Take what you can from the houses and go. Do not return to Chateau-de-la-Mer. You will find no shelter nor solace here. I could hear the grumblings in the back of the crowd. Looking back into it, I could see several of the bigger former field slaves starting to shuffle forward. You have 1 hour. After that, those cabins will be as Chateau-de-la-Mer, devoured in a cleansing flame. You ain't? Someone in the back cried. I can and I will and I am, I told them. We won't let you, another voice yelled. It was at this time several riders slipped from the dark tree line, their rifles at the ready. Is there a problem here, Mr. McNaughton? One of them called. Only that these trespassers refuse to leave my property. I stopped a moment and readdressed myself. Or should I say my brother's property? It was a bit of a legal finagling on my father's part to transfer the land itself to Teddy, so that it could not be confiscated for my deeds as a Confederate officer. I wish to, in a more fitting manner, mourn the loss of my family, uninterrupted by those who caused led to their suffering and demise. Several of the riders approached more carefully. We are sorry to hear about your family, Mr. McNaughton, the man said in a rich New England accent. I looked him up and down and saw that he was wearing the uniform of a Union garrison officer left in the city to see that the peace was kept through President Johnson's Reconstruction. But we simply cannot have a riot on our hands now. Lieutenant, if they leave my land, then there will be no riot. He's going to burn down our houses, someone shouted from the back of the gathered slaves. They are not your houses, I simply said. This land, this property belongs to my brother, and it is in his name I act. I signed my oath of loyalty, I took my parole, and now I wish to return to my home undisturbed. I turned and looked at the man on the horseback, a young lieutenant out on patrol, no doubt. I summoned my will and witcheries and projected them through my voice. Now please, Lieutenant, I have given them sufficient time to clear out their belongings. I will even allow them to take the ploughs and tools that they have no doubt already stolen, along with whatever livestock that there might be here. I simply want them gone, and I want any remaining stain of this war wiped from the face of the property. I could see the effect of my will working on the man's mind. It was a simple magic, but a useful one, and one I had been developing over the last few years. I had others, some even more useful. They would see Teddy and I through what was to come. He nodded, and then announced to the ramble in front of me, Gather what you want, and you can take with you, and leave. The man has given you 1 hour, and I'm going to hold him to that. A low wave of dissent went through the crowd, but they began to disperse, grumbling about 40 acres and a mule. I simply smiled and nodded to the man and said, Thank you, Lieutenant. You realize that when we leave, some of them are likely to come back, don't you? The lieutenant asked. I nodded and replied, Yes, you do realize that a man has the right to self-defense and the defense of his family, even if he's had it in his right to vote stripped from him. Mr. McNaughton, he began. I held up my hand and said, I will make you no promises, Lieutenant. I will defend myself and my brother. You brought him out here? The man asked in surprise. I did, I told him. He has the right to see what is to be done to his land. He has the right to see that his wishes are carried out. This last being something of fiction, but a necessary one. Then we will go back to the city of Bayou Menu and stay until tomorrow. After that, I intend to build a new home here, Lieutenant. No Africans will ever be employed here, only workers for a fair wage. The last I said with obvious bitterness. I intend to rebuild my family's fortune, Lieutenant, and the first thing that requires is to wipe away the old. I looked towards the slave quarters where men, women and children were gathering up what they could, much of it stolen from the plantation, and quickly heading out of the night, including the old vermin. The vehemence of my voice must have caught him off guard as he protested. "That is hardly fair, Mr. McNaughton. Fair or not, our government has seen fit to strip me of valuable property without compensation. And what are these people, Mr. McNaughton? Where should they go? Who will take care of them? You have no heart." I locked my vision between his eyes, but resisted summoning the witcheries. Killing him would accomplish nothing, and actually set back my plans. "You fought a war to free them, Lieutenant. You burned my home, allowed raiders and looters that followed your army to violate and kill my family. These people, as you call them, are now your responsibility, not mine. I wish nothing to do with them ever again." I nodded my head towards the family cemetery, where there was not yet even stones to mark the new occupants of the mausoleum. "My heart is over there. It cannot hear there or your pleas. You are a hard man, Mr. McNaughton. If I am, it is you who have helped me make it so." I looked back at the slave quarters and said, "Any sins my family had towards these people was paid in full with blood and suffering, and have been laid to rest." He simply nodded and then trotted his horse back to the other man in his patrol. I needed to hear their conversation to know what was being said. But my will had overcome the lieutenant's, and I knew that the patrol would be sticking around long enough to make sure that there was no violence done to either side, and possibly to watch the flames as they engulfed the last remains of Chateau-de-la-Mer. But they would not stop me. Riding over to the carriage, I looked in the window where my brother Teddy, barely 10 years of age, sat, his eyes vacant of thought, his mind turned in on itself to avoid the barbarity he had suffered. His left leg gone below the knee from being put in a fire by the raiders to torture from my father, the location of any valuables left from the Union raid that burned it. There was much healing to be done there, and I was going to see to that it was done. Healing of mind, healing of body, healing for him and healing for me as well. Next to him sat the nurse, one Miss Elvira Beaumer, I hired. She was a young woman from another good family beset by the ills of this war, my wages to her being the rest of her family's only income. I was paying for her far more than the duties really required, but it was a way of helping someone less fortunate than myself. I know that her mother was hoping for a different kind of arrangement, something that might be considered at a later time. However, for now, the girl's virtue would be protected, and her family helped her by caring for my brother. It could be a good match, as she too seemed to have the scent of her own witcheries about her. When the hour was up, and the former slaves were stalking away, I smiled and looked at the lieutenant. "Your assistance is appreciated. I would send a thank you note and recommendation to Colonel Shepard, but I doubt it would do your career any favours." I looked into the window of the carriage to see Miss Beaumer and said, "I will return shortly." "Yes, sir," she told me with a smile as she carefully wrapped a blanket around Teddy's shoulders. Then, sliding down from the saddle, I hefted one of the large barrels of oil onto my shoulder from the back of the carriage. I could see the vehicle springs relax from the loss of mass as I snagged a tin pan I'd brought along. I noted the surprised look on the Union soldiers' faces as I carried it with ease to the first of the small squat buildings. Busting open the top of the barrel with my bare fist, I dipped in the pan and began to spread the oil all around the small buildings. My family had always taken pride in the construction of quarters where we housed our slaves, and so they were well-built buildings of sturdy oak. It would take a bit of fuel to get the burning started. It took nearly an hour before the dead was gone, and it was hot and thirsty work in a humid autumn air. But I felt a freedom begin to burn in my soul as I spread the oil, and when it was done, I struck tinder and flint to a torch, and then walked through the rough avenue of buildings, setting each one alight with a torch and with witcheries. First down one side, then up the other. I carried the torch and watched as the wood began to catch fire. By the time I had again reached the carriage, there was a roaring inferno of buildings behind me. I found myself laughing at the anger, and my pain burned away with the last vestiges of what was once called that peculiar southern institution from my family's land. The driver, Miss Beaumer, Teddy, and myself waited there until it had all burned away, and the morning sun was coming up in the east. When the last embers had died down, I noted that both Miss Beaumer and Teddy had fallen asleep in the carriage, gently pulling a travelling rug up over both of them. I nodded to the driver and we returned to Bayou Menu. Now I would begin building. A week later, I found myself at wit's end trying to locate carpenters, woodcutters and masons. It would seem that there was yet a shortage of able-bodied men to work, and with the war and crop failures, it looked like food itself must be in short supply as well for the coming winter. After all the troubles my beloved Dixie had been through, now there was this threat of more misery. It was as if God in his heaven had turned his back on not only our cause, but our people as well. Well, there had always been something of a distance between myself and God, and so I figured I'd let him go his way and I would go my own. I still had things to discover, things that had been unlocked in my soul, first as a youth, then by war, and others had recently only made themselves apparent during my trip home from Virginia. And I still had a responsibility to Teddy. Dr. Meacham was kind enough to come pay a call to the house I had rented, a week after the incident at Chateau-de-la-Mer. Some of the papers were calling it an act of defiance to the occupation of Mobile. Others were calling it an act of contrition. No one seemed to understand that it was an act of cleansing. The doctor evidently had decided not to touch on the subject, a courtesy I found to be most kind. "About Theodore?" he asked. He nodded and said, "There was too much damage to save the leg. The flesh has literally been cooked just below the knee. When the raiders had been unable to gain what they wished and had left, with his dying breath your father cleansed the wound as best he could before removing the leg and bandaging it. It is a wonder your brother survived." I nodded. My mind, which had seen the horrors that man can perpetrate on his fellow man in war, could not fathom the torture of a child, nor the selfless strength of a father to use his dying moments to give his son a fighting chance. And now, the doctor sighed and said, "Physically, the wound is healing rather well. I do not believe we will need to take any more of the leg, and it does not look like the gangrene has set in. But I worry for his mind." I nodded, and I am not afraid in my manhood to say that I held back tears at the thought of what had been done. Can anything help? "He has turned it on himself, I believe. To protect what is left, he has drawn a curtain over the outside world, so to speak. He eats when he is fed. He takes care of necessary ablutions when directed, but he refuses to speak or acknowledge anything else. Is there any hope that he will come to his senses?" The doctor's face showed a deep sympathy in his frown. "I don't believe he will ever be the lively young boy he ever was before. There is hope that he will come out of his fugue state. But, if I might be indelicate enough to say so, he has been touched as deeply, if not more so, by this recent unpleasantness than even you." "It is not indelicate, and I believe you are right in your assumption," I told him. "Is there anything I can do for him?" "Miss Beaumere seems to be a good caretaker, and appears to be quite diligent in keeping his wound clean and seeing to its healing. I believe you made a wise choice in her for his nurse. Continue as you have been." "Might I inquire on another matter?" I asked. "One of a possible delicate subject." He gave me a long stare, and I could nearly hear his own mind wonder if I had gotten myself by one camp follower or another infected by what was colloquially termed the French disease. "Please do," he said. "You were my father's physician for years, and you saw to the care of my family." I began delicately. "Yes," he replied. "Has my father ever hinted to you as to any hereditary characteristics that might be unusual in my family?" The man shook his head and said, "No. I grew up with your father, and we were boyhood friends, and I should think he might mention anything, as you would say, unusual. But to be honest, as far as I know, your father was never sick a day in his life. My services were called upon early in his marriage to your mother, his first wife, as there were some concerns about her being somewhat unusually small for a woman. Concerns which I am sorry to say were quite well founded, in that she did not survive your birth. But, as to your father, there were none." "What can you tell me of my mother?" I asked. My father had never spoken much of my mother. I always suspected it was out of some kind of self-imposed guilt over her dying in childbirth. He had hired a nursemaid for me, and by my 3rd year had married her, and she became the only mother I ever knew. But my father had, on more than one occasion, when we had the opportunity for quiet, uninterrupted conversation, commented that I was not quite mortal. Only that she was like your father. From strong English stock, she was a tiny woman, barely 4.5 feet tall, with the same fine, delicate features you seem to have inherited. Like you, her hair was the colour of champagne, her eyes sparkled with the blue of the sky. She had such a joie de vivre that when she walked into a room, it seemed to come to life with an air of spring. She never complained of the heat, nor the cold, nor much anything. She was the centre of your father's life, and he loved her more than life itself, the man told me. It was more of my mother than I'd ever heard from father, who, as I said, had always been tight-lipped about her. I had always felt that was more out of pain or remembrance than anything else, and so I had not dug too deeply into the issue. He'd done what was necessary to see to my care afterward, and found contentment, if not love, with my stepmother. I nodded and told him, I appreciate your thoughts on the matter, sir. I never knew my mother, and my father never talked much about her. He smiled slightly, and then asked, Is there anything else that I can help you with? I shook my head and said, No, not at this time. Reaching into the bureau drawer, I pulled out an envelope and handed it to him. This should cover your fee and any medications you had to employ up to this point. I would appreciate both your discretion in this matter and about the nature of the payment. Confused, he looked into the envelope, and I knew he could see the gold coins inside. I don't understand. The coins were minted before the war. I would not pay my brother's physician in either Confederate money, which is now deemed worthless, nor in Union greenbacks. Actually, the coins were part of my father's hoard that we'd managed to hide from the Yankees rather well. There were other coins as well, coins brought to me by the aforementioned witcheries. It was with some shock I had realized a few weeks before that, between the two, I could easily make myself one of the most powerful men in the nation. But it had to be done carefully, so as not to raise questions about where the gold was coming from. Is this what your father died for? What your brother was tortured for? He asked, incredulously. Is this what the raiders were seeking? I asked. Possibly, but my father had no access to it, so he could not have given up what he did not know. I nodded my head. Yes, this is why they violated, tortured, and killed my family. My father took certain precautions to protect the family fortune before the war even began. Part of those protections were to put it out of his easy reach as well. I shook my head. I know not whether having access to the gold would have saved Teddy, or my sisters, or the only mother I ever knew, but I somehow doubted it. I had to doubt it, lest I'd follow Teddy down a dark path of despair locked inside my own brain. And what will you do now? He inquired as he quietly slipped the envelope into his pocket. Now, if it is possible to find the labour I need, I will rebuild my home and my estate, and I will take care of my brother. And beyond that, I will not say. He frowned and noted. You said you will not say. You not cannot? I did, I affirmed. My plans are my own for now. There is much due on the balance sheet. Yours or theirs? He asked. Theirs? The men who are responsible for what happened to your family. That man was shot in the back of the head on April 14th of this year. He was the ultimate culprit in all of this. Revenge at this point is out of my hands. Should I have the ability to resurrect him and kill him all over again? Do not doubt that I would do so many times. But alas, I do not. Your words and tones send a chill down my spine, Captain McNaughton. I would prefer you not speak so. I nodded to him. Understood. You are a physician, a man of healing. I am a soldier. But know that the soldier does honour the healer. Thank you, sir, he replied, still somewhat shocked by what I had said. Changing the subject, he asked, You are unable to find men for the construction? It would seem that the war has left many a home bereft of fathers, brothers and sons who would work for an honest day's wage. There are always freedmen, he suggested. They will gain no employment from me. No freedman, nor their misbegotten offspring will ever set foot on McNaughton property again if I have anything to say about it. I would as soon send to Europe for labourers than to employ freedmen. I fought hard to control the sheer hatred from my voice. The cause of the slave had cost me my home and my family. They would not profit from me further. Would that not be prohibitively expensive? He asked. Expensive, yes, I said, and left it at that. Meacham nodded, and his countenance was that of a man who had just remembered something. You asked about your mother. I stopped and said, yes. Your father once told me that he met your mother through Merlin Holmwood, that he introduced them in a rather extraordinary manner, something he never explained. I know that they had a falling out between them over it. I chuckled and said, my father was very good at never getting around to explaining some things. The doctor nodded and said, I've heard that a man regrets the things he didn't do far more than those he did. You may be correct, Doctor. You may be correct. I repeated. Does Merlin Holmwood still reside in Bon Secure? Last I heard, the doctor told me. I thought about that. It was a 2-day trip from the Bayou Menu to Bon Secure, and required taking a ferry. Otherwise the trip was over 100 miles around the bay and the Union, and left a few bridges intact. Bayou Menu was just a few miles south of the city of Mobile, bordered on the north by the Dog River, on the south by the Foul River, and the east by the bay. It was, of course, in Mobile County, and Bon Secure was across the bay in Baldwin County, not far from the old Chateau de la Mer. It was 30 miles or thereabout as the crow flies, and much farther on horseback and ferry. I would have to be gone overnight, and I was not much worried about that, as Teddy was in good hands with Miss Beaumere. I think I shall plan a visit out to pay a call. He's not a very hospitable man, the doctor said. Perhaps, I said. But he's also a man who has information I consider important. Meacham stopped and looked at me before asking, Might I inquire as to what unusual characteristics have you concerned? I laughed and said, Mostly wives' tales, but some things I wish to consider. Such is the lack of beard? He asked. I chuckled and ran my hand over a smooth face. I was well into my 30s and still had no need to shave. Most people considered it an affectation. When the men of my day were heavy with facial hair, I was as smooth as the face of a youngster. Now, what makes you think I simply don't shave every day? It would be an unusual practice, he said, but not unheard of, as there is a fair share of men who do shave every day. But you've been seen with not even stubble for most of your life, either here in Bayou Menu or at your home across the bay, and since your manner of dress tends to be fastidious, most people think little of it. I nodded and said, Exactly, and so? It was at this point the good doctor, checking his timepiece, took his leave of me. For nearly an hour I sat and considered our conversation. I had already decided to continue my employment of Miss Beaumere, and was working my solicitor to arrange for craftsmen and artisans to be brought over from Wales and Ireland. As the doctor had said, it was expensive, but not prohibitively, especially after some of the things I discovered over the last few months. Three days later, I was stepping down from my carriage at the Holmwood estate in Bon Secure. Merlin Holmwood was something of an enigma to the locals. He was born to an English gentry, but due to the rules of primogeniture, he was not inherited a title or land, but had made his own fortune here in the Mobile Bay area. How my father came to know him, I suspect, was from the gentlemen's club to which they both, and now I, belonged. Upon presenting my card, I was shown to the library, where the older man rose from a desk and approached me. He seemed to be studying me carefully, and he was of medium frame, and there were still streaks of brown in his grey hair. He wore a lightweight linen suit with a simple bow tie. Rupert tells me you are Robert McNaughton's oldest son. Nodding, he added, I can see some resemblance, but I would say you take after your mother far more than your father. I bowed slightly and said, Captain Sheridan McNaughton, at your service, sir. You would be Erwin's son then, he said. I would, I told him. Shaking his head sadly, he said, an unfortunate business, that situation. Then, gesturing to a cabinet, he asked, Might I offer you a brandy? Thank you, sir, I said. If I might inquire, what do you mean, an unfortunate business? Your birth, of course, he said, as if it should be clear to all the world. Your mother was not equipped to bear the child of a mortal, yet she decided to do it anyway. He poured the 2 glasses of brandy. You speak of my mother as if she were not mortal, I said harshly. He stopped and said, Did I? I suppose so. Handing me one of the glasses, he said, I begged her not to become with child, as I knew what would happen to her if she did. How is it you were in a position to make such a request? I asked, surprised at the man's candour and seemingly lack of discretion. My dear man, I am, or rather was, her father, he said. The words hit me like a hammer. I never knew my mother had any relatives in this area. Father never told me, I said contritely. I don't suspect he would, Holmwood replied. He was a stubborn man, that one. Looking over at me, and he said, And I suspect, from what I have read in the papers, the same can be said of you. I understand Colonel Shepherd is quite put out with both you and Lieutenant Bradshaw. And I am quite put out with General Cambry for allowing the raiders who followed his army to take liberties with the people of the South. I am furthermore put out with General Sherman's total warfare that was instituted for the stated purposes of making women, children, and old men feel the bite of the cruel jaws of war. Colonel Shepherd is welcome to be put out with me. And should he arrest you? He asked. I would escape and take Theodore somewhere out of the country, I told the man simply. I am sure you understand why I have come. You are undergoing certain changes, Holmwood asked, as he indicated a seat to which I should take. I suspect you have already mastered some of the witcheries that mere mortal men do not possess. Well, in a nutshell, yes, I told him, sipping the rather excellent brandy and sitting. Holmwood leaned back in his chair and said, Then let's get first things in order. I am your grandfather, and in that I am the father of your mother who died in childbirth. As to what that means is that I don't know you, but as your birth was the impetus for my daughter's death, I don't particularly care for you. I think your father understood this. I know he understood that I didn't care for him after my poor Erwin died, and that would probably be projected onto you. Do you wish that I should depart, sir? I asked. I was somewhat shocked by his honesty, but at the same time I appreciated it as well. Where I stood with him was quite clear, unfortunate but understandable and clear. Shaking his head, he said, No, not out of any desire to see you, but because I do not wish to see what you are becoming to be unleashed on this city without at least a modicum of understanding. What am I becoming? You have knowledge of why my father would occasion remark that I am not entirely mortal? I do, he said. Would you be willing to share that information with me? I asked. It would seem that I must, he told me. Taking a deep breath, he said, Your mother was my only daughter, who came to me through a brief marriage to a most extraordinary woman who claimed to be something called a Witchkin. Our time together was brief, intense, and one of the happiest periods of my life. I learned much of the world from Farron and what potential was hidden in the shadows to stalk the night. I don't understand, I told my grandfather. Farron explained to me as that there are races of both immortal and mortal beings who have gifts far beyond those of mortal men. They are the things of phantasmagoria, of childhood fairy tales, witches, vampires, werewolves, and such. And what happened to grandmother? I asked. When Erwin was just entering into womanhood, time and the universe took her mother back from me, he told me. But it left me with a daughter whose legacy was more than mortal. Then with a sad sigh, he added. And now she has left this world with a son who knows not who or what he is, and can be a danger to himself and others. I nodded and said, I am beginning to touch around the edges of certain gifts. I can affect certain changes in the world around me. I can impose my will on others in their minds, and not as strong as my own. He nodded and deduced, Lieutenant Bradshaw? Among others, when I felt it necessary for my own safety and that of my family, I replied. And I am stronger and more durable than other men, I said. No doubt, he told me. But you do have a few weaknesses, or should I say things that your durability will not be as effective against. I have yet to discover them, I said. Certain gemstones and electrical current, he told me. They both will disrupt your durability and your nerves. Fran said that they were part of the parcel of her line of Witchkin, a race whose name she never told me. Like the Loup-Garou and Silver, I asked. Essentially, he told me. And you will eventually feel the pull of the moon. I suspect by the next full moon you will discover permanent changes in yourself. Changes that will require you to concentrate in order to hide. And they will be? I asked. I have no idea, he told me. But I know that your first experience with it is likely to make you highly agitated. They do not call it lunacy without good reason. I chuckled and said darkly, Perhaps then I shall grow a beard. You are likely to grow far more than that, he said harshly. The first change is difficult to say the least, and there is no predicting with what characteristics you will be. Shall we say, blessed? Characteristics? I asked. Permanent alterations to your body. That can only be hidden with concentration and an exercise of the transmogrifying power that gives them to you. There is also increases in the acuity of the senses and of the mental faculties. These can be disorientating and can cause you to act out of frustration, rage, and even lust to harm others. And you know this change is coming when the next moon is full? Why? I asked. Because I can already see it in your aura. The beast is very near the surface. If not for your own safety, for that of your brother and the young lady you've hired to care for him. I beg you, come here to me. We will go into the swamp together and you will learn to master it. Or you will kill me if I don't. It wasn't a question. It was a fact we both knew. He nodded and said, What you are becoming cannot be released uncontrolled. You have very small windows of opportunity to control it. This was the last thing about which your father and I quarrelled. He did not want me interfering with your upbringing. Why? I asked. He sighed and said, Because, as an Englishman, I have different views on this recent war than he did, than your stepmother did. He frowned and added, And because I had my reservations about him sending you to West Point. West Point was my choice, I told him. Father was as displeased as you. And you resigned your commission 2 years into your service to join General Lee's army, he said. I could not stand by and see the federal government dictate illegal orders to the states. Under Lincoln, the Constitution became an impediment to the reign of the imperial federal system, where the states were no longer sovereign unto themselves. Things have not improved under Johnson, and I suspect they shall grow worse as the radical Republicans seek to punish the South for not only seceding, but for the slavery as well. They seem to forget that they were as guilty as any sin towards the African as we in the South, for they formed one point of the triple time in the waltz of molasses, slaves, and rum. With a deep sigh I said, But alas, it is now a mute point. The Confederacy is no more, and I've sworn not to raise arms against the Union again. I have become but a slave to Washington as the Africans had been slaves to my family. And in the future, I suspect that they have but traded one slave master for another. You have some unusual insights. I had not expected that. My grandfather told me. And your reason for burning out the slave quarters at Chateau de la Mer? Well, my own, I said. When he began to take offence, I raised my hand and added, But, as you are blood, you may ask and I will answer. It was not an act of defiance or one of contrition, as the papers are suggesting. It was an act of cleansing. It was wiping away the past so that I might build a new future on the cleansed grounds. "So you intend to rebuild Chateau-de-la-Mer?" he asked. I shook my head and said, "No, I will build a new home. A Bon Travail, a house built upon the good labour of honest men, where I will care for my brother." "Then there is no hatred in your heart from the former slaves of Chateau-de-la-Mer?" he asked. "To the contrary, there is, and ever shall be, a great deal of hatred in my heart for them, and for those who have leashed their chains upon the Southland. But I will not violate my solemn oath to not take up arms against this nation or its people again. However, I can, and I choose to keep these so-called freedmen as far from myself and my family as I can." Okay, a piece of advice from one old man to a young one. Do not let the hatred consume you. What you are and what you are becoming could turn that hatred into a dark and dangerous thing. God, in his great wisdom, had told us to forgive those who have trespassed against us. God in his great wisdom did my mother and my sisters, and my father and brother little good. He may seek forgiveness from them, but as for me, I have none to give. I recognize my hatred, I control it. It does not master me. I paused. Nor will this change of which you speak. It will be mastered, not the other way round, or I will be dead. We will see, Grandfather told me. Looking up, he asked me, "Then I may plan to see you in 2 weeks on the night the moon is full." I nodded and said, "I will be there. I owe you and Mother that much at least." "You are a strange man, Sheridan McNaughton. I am unsure as to whether that is a good thing or not." I spent the next 2 weeks putting my estate in order with plans for building a new Bon Travail, extended over the next year. I tapped several overseas accounts to set up trust to see to its construction, to my specifications, and to take care of my brother. It would create a delay in payments, but it could not be helped, as it would hide my other wealth. My solicitor seemed surprised when I also made plans for Theodore to be cared for should anything happen to me. I found myself assuring him that I was simply taking care of matters of need in these uncertain times. Things continued at a pace as I made precautions and preparations for my meeting with Mr. Holmwood. I had no reservations about what he had told me, as fantastic as it might seem. I had seen too much of it in my life already up to this point, and to be honest, I could feel the beast he mentioned begin to rise in my soul. But as I had indicated earlier, with a determined and disciplined mind, I was going to master this thing. I went out of my way to hide the growing agitation in my soul through the genteel behaviour of a southern gentleman and officer, and I believe to this day that I was successful. That being said, I also could not deny the image of a pacing animal in my thoughts, the call of both the sea and the winds, and it was greatly distracting. Still, by putting my affairs into order and action prior to the solicitation becoming overwhelming, I was able to see that my wishes and my needs were carried out. Holmwood had sent a message to me that I should bring several changes of clothes and I should plan to be gone for 3 days to a week. As the date of the full moon approached, I made plans for Theodore and Miss Beaumere to be well guarded, using the excuse of the threats of violence and unrest from the slow trickle of carpetbaggers who were beginning to appear in our fair city. Granted, they were not yet as much trouble as they were in Mobile, but they were still an issue. Hiring 2 constables to watch over the house while I was gone was a simple matter and did much to ease my mind. On the day of the full moon, it was hot and humid, and Holmwood had acted surprised when I actually arrived at his home. "You are indeed a man of your word, Captain McNaughton." "And why would I not be?" I demanded. He shook his head and said, "No reason, but you seem to be uncharacteristically calm and reasonable. That is not a trait your mother showed at this time." I could see in his mind's eye the images of a young woman wholly on the verge of some kind of animalistic transformation, and realized with some trepidation that I saw my own features in her. Perhaps the dilution of more, as you and father called it, mortal blood into the mixture offers me some protection, I told him. As he gathered what appeared to be a doctor's travelling bag, he stopped and asked, "Do you genuinely believe that?" "I do not know what to believe, Mr. Holmwood. I acknowledge that, as you said, there is a beast growing inside me. I acknowledge that it seems to be on the verge of bursting forth in my soul, even as we speak. But I will not give in to baser desires. The man rules the beast, not the other way round." A sardonic smile crossed his visage. "Perhaps you are right. I honestly hope you are so, but only the next 3 nights will tell." Grabbing his coat, he said, "Come, I have prepared a place for us to explore what is happening to you together. Did you remember to bring the clothing?" I nodded and tapped the saddlebag on my horse. "In here." "Good," he said. "Bring the saddlebag. My people will take care of the horse for you." Nodding, I pulled the bag from the horse, pausing a moment to run a finger along the CSA tooled into the leather. I could still detect the scent of burning powder and blood on it, and for a second in my mind echoed the ring of a steel against steel and the cannon's roar. The touch and the feel of the leather did more to put the beast in my soul in its place than anything else. The memories it brought were enough to send the beast skittering to the corners of my mind. Holmwood spun on me. "What did you do?" Throwing the bag over my shoulder, I said, "The touch of the leather brings powerful memories. I believe the beast is wary of them." Interesting," the man said as he nodded, and we began our trek on foot into the swamps surrounding one of the oldest fishing settlements on the Gulf Coast. The late autumn weather was warm and humid, and I considered removing my coat as we trekked deeper into the swamps until we came upon a well-constructed cabin built over the black waters of a nearly concealed slough. I could hear the grunting and of the calling of everything from alligators to the brown pelicans that frequented such areas. The cabin itself, as I said, was well constructed, and from the look of the wood, it had been hewn from strong swamp oaks, sometimes called mock iron, and I noted the steel bands that wrapped the building in several places, as if to reinforce it. Looking over at Holmwood, I asked, "To keep things in or to keep things out?" "A little bit of both," he said. "Come on in." He unlocked the door for me and stepped back. That should have been the only warning I ever needed, but in my mind was distracted by the events with the saddlebag. I stepped into the front room of the cabin onto a metal grating. I felt the cold splash of water soak me to the bone, and I tried to scream in pain, but I could not control my muscles as fire and force raced through my body. As I collapsed to the wet cold metal grating, I saw Holmwood smile evilly. I have no idea how long it was before I regained my senses. When I awoke, I had been stripped and chained to a wall. I was still soaking wet, and my back from my shoulders to my hips ached and itched mightily, as did the top of my scalp. Looking down, I realized I was still standing on a metal grating, and there were iron bars separating this part of the room from the next. My senses seemed strange, sharper. I could smell the rank stench of the swamp outside the cabin, and, from across the other side of the barn, the smell of man, specifically that of Merlin Holmwood. As I raised my head and rattled the chain, he looked up from where he was writing in some kind of journal and smiled. "I would not pull on those too harshly were I you. They are connected to the same series of electrical batteries that rendered you unconscious. All I have to do now is throw the switch, and a lethal dose of electricity will be sent coursing through your body." "What is all this about, Holmwood?" I demanded. Looking down at his journal and then back up, he made several notes before digning to my answer and my inquiry. When his face rose again, his visage had completely changed. Gone was the calm manner of an English gentleman, replacing it with that of a driven man, sanity having long escaped the clutches of some obsession. He picked up a short stylus of about 4 inches and turned it over in his hand. It was curved slightly from end to end, and its side bowed in on each other to form a sharp point at one end. "This is about my continuing my experiments." He paused for a moment and then asked, "Tell me, How does it feel for the former slave master to feel the bite of chains? I thought you were going to help me, I said. What is this perfidy? Help you? He asked. Heavens, no! I'm going to study you. I'm going to complete my research. As the moon reaches its apex tonight, you should change, as your mother did, as your grandmother did. Ungrateful wenches they were. His tone was 180 degrees from the reasonable man of means and breeding with whom I'd spoken to earlier. You seem to have me at a disadvantage, I told him. And you have not answered my question, he countered. Shrugging, I said, I'm a soldier. I understood when I went into battle that, should I be captured, being clapped into irons might be among the more pleasant things that could happen to me. So you feel no kinship towards the men you held as cattle for years? He demanded. Is that what you are doing here, trying to extract some kind of retribution from me because my family held slaves? I asked. Do you wish me to beg for forgiveness for the sins of my family? I did not try to hide the contempt from my voice. He laughed at me and said, Not at all. I am just curious as to what effect it has upon your mental state. It would seem to be none. My mental state is agitated and quite put out, as you would say, I said. Now what is the meaning of all of this? I mean to study what you are. I mean to understand what it is that Farron and Erwin were. As my eyes scanned the room of what appeared to be tables with straps and very sharp instruments of surgery that I'd seen on the battlefield, I felt a cold fear start to rise in my chest. Going to a wall on the other side of the room, he adjusted something on a box with wires leading to the ceiling. Then, picking up another smaller box with wires leading back to the first, he came to the edge of the bars and picked up the stylus again with the other hand. Step closer to the bars and bowed your head slightly. His voice changed to one of curiosity. To what purpose? I asked. Harshly, his demeanour changed and he said, Because I ordered it! With a vicious stab at the box, I felt a jolt of pain and fire as more electricity tore its way through my body. When I came to, I was collapsed to my knees on the floor, my arms suspended above my head. Now, perhaps you will be more willing to cooperate. Step towards the bars and bow your head. I want to see what alterations your condition is making to your scalp. Weakly pulling myself to my feet, I realized that at this point I had no choice but to comply. With as much dignity as I could muster in my current condition, I stepped forward and did as he bade, looking him in the eye until my head was forced down and I felt a sharp stylus dig through my scalp. It was sharp, it was painful, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of even wincing, much less crying out. He seemed to be rooting around in my scalp for something, and I realized that two large pustules had formed on either side of my head. With a sense of surprise, I noted the pain of the digging and the draining of whatever might be inside of them. But, with its completion, the itching in my scalp seemed to go away. As he stepped back and grinned hugely and said, There. Much to my surprise, the auditory senses suddenly fled in acuity. I could literally hear the man's heart beating in his chest. What? I asked. The changes have begun, he told me, almost giddy with excitement. I thought that was all a lie, I protested. Not quite, he said. More of a series of half-truths. Farron was already with child when I stumbled across her, injured and close to dying. I learned what I could from her, but my wife, she was not. I studied her while she was yet alive. She told me of the Witchkin and how there were many kinds. She gave me some inkling of their hierarchy of power amongst them. She left me with the impression that she was among the upper echelons of that hierarchy. She told me of her clan of therianthropes with unusual mind gifts. His voice changed again and he added, And then I was forced to kill her. Why? I asked. Because she was an ungrateful wench who was going to take her daughter and leave so that I might not know her as I did Farron. Exactly what did you do? I demanded. I cut from both of them their therianthrope aspects, and I studied them. I would have eventually understood their secret of shape-shifting had your father not become involved and run off with Erwin. He smiled evilly and said, Now turn around. I want to see if the others have started to appear. Others? I demanded. "The same feral features that your mother and your grandmother had." Holding up my hands, I said, "Twisting while chained to the wall like this is not exactly easy. You will comply, or I will render you unconscious with the batteries again," he warned. Twisting as best I could, I turned around. In doing so, I noticed my hands and nails. A blue membrane was developing between my fingers, and my nails had started to harden and grow, not unlike the stylus Holmwood had used to cut into my scalp. He chuckled and said, "Those are new." "What?" I asked. "The webbing between your fingers. Neither your mother nor your grandmother had them." I smiled and said, "Remembering some of my basic Mendelian biology, I observed, perhaps a sex-linked characteristic. If I was going to be treated like a laboratory specimen, I was going to get some information about it. Or perhaps there was more to your father than either of us realized. Farron told me that those of her clan were incapable of crossbreeding with humans, but I suspected that that was a lie. She did say that there were a few species they could breathe with, and merfolk and nixies were among those. But then again, as I said, she could have been lying." "Are you suggesting that my father wasn't entirely human?" I asked as I felt the stylus begin to dig into my right shoulder. I could feel blood and fluid flow down from the wound and down my back, my buttocks, thighs and legs to the ground. I felt something emerge from the wound he was causing and flop against my skin, warm and wet. Then he started on the other side, and again I noted that even with his digging and the nearly blinding pain it caused, I could feel the itching subside in my skin. Suddenly, I felt an intense pain at the base of my spine, and I felt the sharp intake of breath. "That one was painful, I take it?" Holmwood asking, his voice seemingly to enjoy the thought. Grunting, I said, "As you wish." "You're going to be stubborn about this," he said. "Good. Your mother and grandmother were not much of a challenge." I had just about had my fill of this man and his gouging, both emotional and physical. I spun the chains and lashed out. With some surprise, I noted that the nails on my hand had grown quite long as they skittered against the bars of the cell, making sparks like metal strikes. I had just about had my fill of this man and his gouging, both emotional and physical. I spun in the chains and lashed out, and with some surprise I noted that the nails on my hand had grown quite long as they skittered against the bars of the cell, making sparks like metal striking stone. I noted the stylus he used dropped from his hand, and its coloration was not unlike that of my nails. Then he jabbed the button on his infernal box, and the pain hit me again as I felt my body arch into the throes of agony. My throat tightened, and my heart raced as my limbs took on a mind of their own. Before I blacked out again, I noted Holmwood wiping blood from his face where I had caught him with a stray claw. I awoke strapped face down on a steel table, my arms and legs spread eagled. I could feel the manacles on my wrists and ankles bite deep into my still soaked flesh. Trying to turn over, I pulled against the right manacle and felt the metal groan before I was hit again with another powerful jolt of electricity that set my muscles to straining against the metal, increasing the current's connection to my body and surging it even more powerfully through me. The more powerful the current that ran through me, the more my muscles spasmed. The table groaned again, and the odour of burning flesh began to fill my nostrils. In horror, I realised it was my own. Then there was a series of loud pops that were not unlike the sounds of clay jugs being broken. The current ceased, and I lay forward on the table and pulled my hands over my head in exhaustion. I know not how long I lay there, drifting in and out of sensibility, but it was finally the smell of burning wood that raised the some animal instinct of self-preservation in me. Raising my head, I looked up and saw a rolling cloud of thick, acrid smoke drifting down from the ceiling as the sounds of flames licking the wood caught my attention. It was then that I realised my hands were free, and I pushed myself upward off the table. I was still in an unattainable position with my feet clamped in manacles, but I could feel that they were loose. Raising myself up to my knees, I turned to look behind me, but something large and feathered kept getting in my way. Instead, I felt around with my hands until I found the manacles, and then pulled at them. They came away with a surprising ease, and I slid off the table. Looking around the room, I could see the large iron-bound oaken door. I pushed against it and realised it was locked. Scanning the room quickly, I noted the grating on the floor, the barrelled cell where I'd been earlier, and several surgical tools, including a stylus Holmwood used to dig into my flesh. Several other points of interest came to mind. Something large was sitting on my shoulders and kept interfering with my movements about the room. As the smoke began to fill the cabin, I began to panic. Out of sheer frustration, I stepped back and kicked the door and its lock. With a great splintering, the door's iron-bound lock came loose and it slammed outward and into the side of the building. The bang echoed through the swamp like a shot. Naked and choking on the acrid smoke pouring from the door behind me, I stumbled out onto the path leading to the cabin. It was night, but between the full moon above and the illumination from the burning building, I had little trouble seeing as I stumbled further into the swamp. My ordeal and lack of nourishment over however long I had been in that god-forsaken place finally took their toll, and I collapsed onto the creek bank as the moon bathed me in its silver light. As I drifted into oblivion, I felt something else take over my mind. My dreams were delirious. My body shifted first to that of a great raptor. I found myself gliding over the landscape, searching and hunting, my mind only along for the ride as my dreams took me where the beast inside me chose to go. I could feel the bite of my wings on the warm autumn night air and how it lifted me higher. I could see the amazing amount of detail on the ground as I searched the edges of the backwater, circling the edge of the swamp. I spotted Holmwood speeding his way towards the burning building in the slow. Reaching it, I could see the fear on his face as he began to track my footprints in the soft, moist soil. Strangely, he reached where my body was, but I could see no sign of it. Then, I watched as the ground rushed up towards me and my body flowed from one form to another. Holmwood never saw what hit him from behind. Great white claws ripped and tore at his flesh. The blood flowing from his throat tasted rich and salty. Then claws tore his heart from his chest, and I could taste the raw, rich meat as it went down. Leaving the body of the man who had tortured me sent surges of electricity through my body and gouged my flesh with painful claws. My dream self turned to hunt. I began to stalk the night, hunting down those who had aided him in doing this to me, and rendering them and tearing their flesh. The rich salty taste of blood and flesh filled my senses, and I became the victim of phantasms from my own mind. And that was the last I remembered, until I woke again in my own bed. Miss Beaumere bathing my forehead with a warm cloth. "What?" I asked, reaching up and holding her wrist away from me. "You have been ill, Captain McNaughton." She turned from me and called, "Dr. Meacham, he's awake." Before I could say much else, the door to the room opened and Dr. Meacham came in. Looking at Miss Beaumere, he said, "Give us a few moments, Severa." The woman nodded and said, "Oh, of course, Doctor. I will go and check on Theodore." "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like part of me has been ripped to shreds," I told him, "and I have a foul taste in my mouth." He nodded and said, "Lieutenant Bradshaw found you in the swamp." He said, "It looked like as if you were in a fight with a swamp cat, probably the same one that killed Merlin Holmwood." "Swamp cat?" I asked. He nodded and added, "According to the lieutenant, his patrol found your tracks and those of a large cat in the same area. He thinks it's a swamp panther, and based on the wounds on your back and your head, I would say he was right. Do you remember anything?" Feeling it best not to repeat what I had dreamt, I said, "No, only going out to Holmwood's place for a visit. Beyond that, I remember nothing." Meacham sighed and said, "Oh, well, Holmwood's place was torn to pieces. Nobody was left alive. They found him ripped to shreds and his heart devoured by some great cat. You know yourself we get them in this area from time to time." I began to wonder just how much of that dream was actually a dream. And to further my unease, I suddenly got the image of one of the swamp panthers, sometimes called painters, licking its chops. Oddly enough, this one was not the normal tawny colour we know of them, but was an off-white with blue eyes, the same blue that I saw when I looked in the mirror. How long have I been unconscious? I asked. Nearly a week. From some of the other scarring, it looks like you've been chained up. Do you not remember anything? I shook my head and looked down at the nasty scars on my wrists and wondered if there were any on my ankles as well. What happened to me? That is something we would like to know, Captain McNaughton. The voice was one I had not heard before and came from the door. Looking over, I could see a man wearing a Union colonel's uniform. Poor Miss Beaumere was standing behind him, looking rather stricken. I tried to tell him that you were with the doctor, Captain, she said. It's all right, Miss Beaumere, I told her. Then, with as much iron in my voice as I could muster, I added, we all understand how the Union Army feels a need to force itself upon us. The man chuckled and said, I was told that you had a singular wit. I'm Colonel Shepard, in command of the Army's forces left to keep peace. Now be honest, Colonel, you mean occupying force, I said. Well, if you are well enough to trade barbs with the Colonel, then you are probably well enough to put something on your stomach. Dr. Meacham said with a grin. Come along, Miss Beaumere, and we'll see what we can find in the pantry. Doctor, I said, before you leave, how is my brother? I saw a genuine smile come across his face. Ah, there is good news on that front, Captain. He seems to be slowly coming out of his fugue. Miss Beaumere says he was highly agitated the night you disappeared, but as soon as you were brought home, he seemed to come out from behind whatever walls he'd retreated. He wants to speak with you when you feel up to it. The Colonel actually smiled and said, that is good news. I was most distressed to hear about what happened to the young man. Distressed enough to find the men who assaulted him and my family? I asked. Or are you still concerning yourself with protecting those who cry unionist to hide from the arm of justice for all manner of crimes ranging from robbery to foul murder, or to the assault of women? This time I was clearly mocking him. Or perhaps you are occupied in rebuilding a third of the city of Mobile, a city that has surrendered to your General Canby peacefully, but then had been nearly destroyed because evidently the federal troops are incapable of properly storing munitions. Or perhaps I am dealing with people who refuse to accept they lost a war of rebellion to preserve a non-existent right of the states to succeed and the right to keep your fellow man in chattel slavery. He replied. I sighed and said, those questions have been settled forever. The people will stand by it. It has been settled by the highest court of resource, that of trial of arms. But I will quote the Reverend Summers. I have not found a planter who does not think the abolition of slavery a great misfortune to both races. But all recognize abolition to be the accomplished fact. My admission seemed to have caught the man off guard. He smiled and said, I came here to speak with you about your ordeal at Holmwood Place. Dr. Meacham is under the impression that you may have been held against your will. I do not remember, I told the man. The same doctor has informed me that I have 2 severe head wounds. Shepard nodded and said, that is both understandable and unfortunate. Holmwood had a reputation for being a unionist. I wondered why you would go and visit him. I smiled and said, I was informed that Mr. Holmwood had facilitated my father and my mother meeting and marrying. As I knew little of my mother, I had gone to see and find out what family I might have left. Knew little of your mother? He asked. The lady who died at Chateau de la Mer was my true mother, the woman who raised me and the only mother I ever knew. But she was not my birth mother. She died in childbirth. Her name was Erwin Holmwood McNaughton. Evidently my father's marriage to her quite upset Mr. Holmwood, and beyond that, I remember little. So you and Holmwood are related? He asked. I shrugged and said, as I indicated, I have little memory of the meeting between us. He indicated that she had been his daughter when I first met him a fortnight ago, and we planned, in what I believed to be a cordial meeting, to discover more of my mother and family. But alas, I remember nothing other than arriving there with my horse and saddlebag. Shepard nodded and said, I have arranged to have them return to you later today. The animal has been badly frightened, but is holding up well. He is bred for war and served me well throughout the recent campaigns, I told him. Thank you for your kindness. I did not mention how cattle and horse thievery have been running rampant in the western part of the state for over a year now. I am informed that you have engaged men in clearing the borders of your state, he said. I have, I told him. To what purpose? To build a wall, Colonel Shepard. It will completely surround the property. It will be built in the European style, 20 feet high, 6 feet thick, and will completely surround the grounds. Another inner wall will surround the home I am rebuilding. Might one inquire as to where the money for such an endeavour is coming? He asked. Well, before the war, my father saw to moving many of our assets to Europe in case things should go badly. A precaution that may have cost him his life, but has proven to be wise in preserving a said fortune for my brother and myself. I sighed. From my discussion with my solicitor, it appears that I must perhaps become an engineer, a railroad baron, and builder of roads if the South is to be spared too many of the ravages of the radical Republican and Puritans in Congress who insist on not only defeating us, but punishing us for daring to defy them when they steal our wealth. You don't give an inch, do you, Captain? He asked. When it's warranted, Colonel, as I said, I thank you for your kindness to my horse and to seeing that he has returned to me, I replied. So, you are attempting to alleviate the situation here in the South? He asked. Sir, I may not like you, but I respect you. My poor state has been laying prostrate, its people beaten. Our crops have failed, our property destroyed, our roads and bridges, railways and steamboats rendered useless. We have had unleashed upon us a capering race of men who are at this point entirely incapable of caring for themselves and demand that the government care for them in our place. As you are discovering, they will not work for you, and they will no longer work for their former masters. So what is to be done with them is still an issue to be resolved. Our situation is dire and desperate. If my poor efforts in some way alleviate the situation as you say, then yes. And what do you gain from it? He demanded. You are forbidden from voting, much less holding office. What am I to gain for it? I asked him. I gain the safety of my brother, I gain the prosperity that once graced this great land, and I gain some security for my family and for my race. I shook my head and said, if you think I would do this for some political gain, then you are sadly mistaken. I do it for the most of selfish reasons. I do it to see my beloved Alabama rise first to her knees and then to stand on her feet again as a member fully recognized in the halls of government, not with me at the helm, nor even men I would choose, but with the men of good honour who are far better fit for government than I. And the former slaves, he asked, what role do you see them in this newly risen state? None, I said. I give them no more concern than I do the birds of the air. They are your responsibility now, not mine. With the burning of the fields and the buildings that house them, I have washed my hands of them. My new home will no longer be troubled by them. I have sent to Europe for craftsmen and workers who will give an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. You wouldn't side with England or France then? He demanded. I shook my head and said, not at all. I have signed my oath of loyalty and will never again raise an arms against this government. But artisans and workers are in short supply here, and in abundance there. It is simply the law of supply and demand. He nodded and seemed to consider his next words very carefully. I am curious as to how Chateau de la Mer was not seized under the acts of confiscation. I laughed and said, that may actually end up being my undoing, Colonel. A great deal of it will rest on what agreements my brother and I shall reach. I don't understand, he said. My father, although he supported the succession, never took up arms against the Union. He, like myself, would have been excluded from regaining our rights under Johnson's pardon because he held in property value over $20,000. I am excluded as I am a graduate of the West Point who went to war alongside General Lee. But Chateau de la Mer and its property was left to my brother in my father's will. Our overseas accounts were left to me as his guardian. I had, and to a lesser extent, still have some control over the property. So it's not your property? He asked. Technically, no. I smiled at him and said, and you are welcome to try and take it from him. By the time the press is finished with you for confiscating the land of a 10-year-old boy, He saw his sisters and mother violated and murdered by raiders wearing Union blue. He was tortured by placing his leg into hot coals so that his father might reveal the location of any valuables not yet stripped from the properties. I can guarantee you that you will be as revealed in the north as you are here in Mobile. I chuckled and added, had you not let those men kill my father, then you would have been able to see some of the most fertile soil in all of Alabama. But alas, General Cambry didn't do his job, or perhaps he did do it too well. We could force you to turn over the overseas assets, he suggested. And where are they? Find them. My voice became harsh. Do not go down this road with me, Colonel. You will not win. I will protect my brother and my family. I will not see him humiliated any more than he already has been. I focused my gaze between his eyes and unleashed my witcheries. I was surprised at the instant result. The man was literally stunned for several seconds by the force of my very thoughts. Something had indeed changed in that swamp. After several long moments, he simply nodded and said, I don't see a need to pursue the matter any further. I wish you and your brother a speedy recovery. Not long after the Colonel had left, there was a slight knock at my door. Looking up, I saw Teddy peeking from behind the crack. With a smile of genuine love and affection, I obeyed him. Don't just stand there. Come in, tadpole. He smiled at the name with which I would tease him when he was just a lad who would take him to swimming nearby before he could walk. An uncommon skill, to say the least. With a slow, tentative skill, he worked his way into the room using the crutches that had evidently been supplied to him while he was recovering. He was thinner than when I had last seen him, but instead of a lean, hungry look, I saw in too many children in the streets. It was more of a slimming one experienced from increased activity. I suspected the crutches had much to do with that. His hair was a warm brown that hovered somewhere between chestnut and red, and his eyes were twinkling green like his mother. I patted the side of the bed next to me and encouraged him to cross the room to sit next to me. You're looking better, I told him. I'm feeling better, he said in a voice just above a whisper. Miss Beaumere has been very kind. There was a reticence in his voice and his tone. I'm glad to hear it, I told him. But I am somewhat disappointed. About? He asked with genuine concern. That I have not yet received the right and proper welcome from my brother, I told him. With a flash of speed that only a youth can generate, he was across the bed and his arms were around my neck. A flood of tears burst forth from both of us as our long-delayed reunion was finally made a real and solid thing. I know not how long we held each other's embrace or how long the tears welled from our eyes, but I thank Dr. Meacham and Miss Beaumere for their discretion in the matter of dropping a lid down the hall to give us time to compose ourselves before they entered the room. As they entered, we'd at least had time to recover a modicum of manly decorum, although my heart soared with joy to see him moving about with both will and wit. We have a great deal to discuss, Tadpole, I told him. We do, he said. Miss Beaumere has explained some of it to me, but there are things I need to hear from you, Dan. There was a seriousness to his voice that was not there when I left for the war 5 years, and for him half a lifetime ago. He spoke with a tone of countenance of a man and not a child. Thank you, Miss Beaumere, I said with a smile. Then, looking at the 2 plates on the platter, I asked, what did you and the doctor happen to find in the pantry? She smiled and uncovered the dish to reveal pan-fried catfish and fried mustard greens. Teddy managed to catch the fish this morning, down in the river, and I picked the greens from the field. Cook used some leftover bacon grease to flavour the greens, and we got the salt by drying out seawater. It's not exactly the kind of meal that you are accustomed to eating, Captain, but it's beginning to be difficult to find food to purchase. When the Yankees burned out the crops, they burned out the seed crop as well. I nodded and said, I understand, Miss Beaumere, and not only your resourcefulness, but your spirit does credit to the southern lady you are. Thank you, Captain McNaughton, she said with a sweet smile that lit up the room. Then, turning to the doctor and Teddy, she said, If you gentlemen will excuse me, I'm sure you have things to discuss, and I have a few things to do with the house. After she disappeared out the door, I noted a slight smile on the face of my little brother. I believed that an older woman had indeed captured his young heart, She manages your household as well as any estate captain I've ever met, Dr. Meacham said. She will make someone a fine wife someday. I chuckled and toused Teddy's hair and said, "Hear that, Teddy? I think the doctor means for one of us to marry that young lady. Do you think she'd be willing to wait until you're of age?" "Dan!" Teddy blushed deeply as he took one of the plates from the tray. "Both of you, cease your tomfoolery and eat your meal. That's more meat than most people in town are getting these days." He stopped and looked at Teddy and said, "Young Theodore is quite the fisherman, and may be the only reason your household doesn't starve." He shook his head and added, "Although I would prefer you didn't go down to the river alone. There have been some issues lately." "Issues?" I asked. "Thievery and that sort of thing. With the plantations failing, there are those who would rather steal someone else's food than earn their own," Meacham said. "Don't worry, Dr. Meacham," my brother said. Then, in a firm voice, he declared that he would never let a freedman get close enough to him to steal anything, ever again. Unfortunately, the word he used was a word of low degree. That was a habit I thought it best to break now. "Theodore," I said sharply, "that is not the word of a gentleman. That is not the word a gentleman uses. The correct term is African, or if you must, freedman. That word is one of low breeding and beneath the dignity of a McNaughton." I watched him blink back tears. My words were harsher than I meant. I reached down and put a hand on his shoulder. I'm sorry. I know things have been difficult, and what's going on in the country has put in the minds of certain classes of men that what is ours is theirs to take, and by force if needs be. You have suffered enough, and I don't want to lose you." "It's just a word," he said. "They use it all the time." "All the more reason for you not to imitate them. You don't want to be dragged down to their level, do you?" I asked. Vigorously shaking his head, he said, "Nothing will ever drag me that low." I could sense in his mind a deep and abiding distrust and hatred of the black race. I could see, in his memories, the laughing faces of the men who had held his leg in the hot coals, and some of them were not just raiders following the army. Some of them had been field hands from our own estates. Books were definitely going to be balanced on that account. I smiled and said, "For now, let's you and I be the ones going down and doing the fishing together, Tadpole." His eyes lit up at the suggestion, and he nodded. "Good. Now let's finish this excellent meal that Miss Beaumere has prepared for us." Wow. Awesome stuff, Wayne. Absolutely awesome stuff. I really am sorry again for not getting this in order, and to all of you listeners as well. Obviously the story will make a lot more sense. There's still another part of the story to come following on from this one, and I'll probably drop that tomorrow, if not the day after. As ever though, please do let us know down below in the comments what you thought. Please do like and share, help build the channel and our community further, and of course, don't forget to hashtag TeamFEAR. I hope you're all well and happy, feeling fit as a fiddle, and looking forward to a wonderful working week. And above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.